Point being, you're manhunting and you're putting together a pattern of life and you're waiting for a trigger, meaning you don't want to go to this person's house if they're not there, just because they're usually there. Well, you have to know that they're there. Same thing downrange. So it wasn't that much classified type stuff. It was just in Baghdad or wherever else that we were doing it. So yeah, that ambush was impactful, I would say, because the reason we ended up in it, and I talk about this in the first book as a memory. So my protagonist is walking to a meeting essentially where he's going to take somebody off the board. And he's thinking he's reminded of the streets around where this took place.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served Warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we hear the combat story of Jack Carr, who many of us know as the author and creator of the book series and Amazon hit show Terminal List. Before becoming an accomplished author, however, Jack was a Navy SEAL, both enlisted and as an officer. He served as a sniper, led a platoon, and even a task force in combat. Jack is one of the most well-read people we've ever interviewed and has had tremendous success as a creator, SEAL, husband, father, and outdoorsman. I gravitated to Terminal List on Amazon because it so authentically depicts the emotions of a combat veteran, because it features a secondary character from Zimbabwe that elicits an amazing background that is so familiar to me from my upbringing in that part of the world, and that Jack and I speak about as we kick off the show. Jack is releasing his 6th book, Only the Dead, on May 16th, and if it's anything like the first 5, it's sure to be great. I hope you enjoy this combat story with none other than Jack Carr as much as I did. Jack, thanks so much for taking the time to share your story with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. This is awesome. I like the backdrop there. There's books that look fairly organized. I think those are coins down there.
Yep.
Got the Apache up there. Got the CIA crest shield there. Man in the Arena. And then, hey, a YouTube. Look at that. Is that
That's right.
At 100,000?
That's 100,000. So I know it's not a lot compared to you and these other guys out there.
That's YouTube. That's what I'm at essentially on YouTube as well. It's kind of cool. It's kind of a cool thing to get. It looks sharp, looks modern. But kind of cool to have those milestones.
It gives me a lot of street cred with my kids. So like that's the
only thing. My kids were very impressed. No one else is.
No
kids
one else
were very impressed when I got that. They couldn't believe it. So, and like the blue check mark, like my daughter was looking at stuff one day and her friend was like, someone with a blue check mark? It was like a thing, but yeah, the kids are not impressed by anything. They were impressed for a few minutes after Chris Pratt optioned the Terminal List. He made him a couple videos, like happy birthday type.
That's awesome.
That sort of thing. So they were impressed, but they go back to being not impressed very quickly, these kids. Yeah. It's tough. I
got to say, I took my last day at the agency because I had dropped my cover. I was able to go in. I took my kids to like a take your kids to work day. And I was like, you guys should be so impressed. And they could not care less. They're like, oh, I can't wait till we go into Silicon Valley and get to see Google and these other places. So
no kidding. How old were they when you took them there?
Probably the oldest was about 10 or 11. Okay. I mean, don't get me wrong. They thought it was cool. There's a jet in the parking lot. There's like an Mi-17 there. It's awesome. And I guess behind me, you probably can't see it, but I got a tail rotor blade.
Okay. Yeah, I see it now.
Who was a logistics guy acquired and gave to me on my wedding. So that's like my prize.
Awesome. That is really cool. Amazing. I love it. And where are you right now? Where's home base?
Bay Area. So near San Francisco.
Got it. Oh,
I know you got a good backdrop. We'll talk about the outdoorsman in you as well, but I wanted to kick off. Like, I'm definitely a fan of the series, Jack. So like, I'm going to try to not nerd out too much, but the thing that really caught me, I know Chris Pratt, that's cool. Terminal List, like on Amazon. It's this guy, Rafe, that I want to start with, this character. So I spent 4 years of my childhood in Harare, Zimbabwe. I grew up playing rugby. I grew up with all of these folks. And when I read, like, I know you touch on him in the first book, but I think is a true believer when he really without spoiling it for people, like there's a lot of backstory. It takes place in Africa. I wanted to start there. Like I rarely hear people talk about Zim. Where'd it come up for you?
Yeah, well, one that I've always been drawn to that area of the world. when you're studying insurgencies and counterinsurgency campaigns and that sort of a thing. The Selous Scouts and Gray's Scouts from that time frame is should be part of the canon. And it's something that's really not talked about very much, especially in political thrillers. I think people stay away from it. One, because it's kind of complicated. It's not as easy as having someone with a background from, let's say, he was a U.S. Special Forces guy in Vietnam, or was in Mogadishu, or something along those lines. It's just a little bit different for most Americans. But people who are into it, people that have been to Africa, either or whether it's on safari, but more in particular, like hunting over there, are really drawn to it because there's not that many options. When you're going to the airport in Johannesburg, and there's some great nonfiction on the shelves. It's a little harder to track down here. You can find it in the UK, you can find it in Australia, in New Zealand, that sort of thing. But it's just a little bit harder to find in the United States unless you're looking for it. And the people that are looking for it are a very small segment. So I spent some time in Africa. I was always interested in that part of the world. And I read, we were just talking before we started actually about going to Mali in the military. And around that time frame, I think it was that time frame, I read The Fate of Africa. And that was a very thick book. It's you can use it as a weapon or a doorstop if necessary. And what struck me in that, and it's more like an academic type study, but what struck me was how similar not all countries, many of the countries that that author explores in The Fate of Africa had very similar experience switching over from colonial rule, for lack of a better term, into what they became. They have that very similar story around a similar time frame. We're talking 50s, 60s, 70s. So I was just very interested in that part of the world. So I wanted a character that I differentiated from my protagonist, James Reese, Chris Pratt. So I just didn't want another SEAL that had different color hair, you know what I mean, to differentiate them. So I wanted a different background. I wanted someone who was used different weapons because of his upbringing and what was passed on to him by his grandfather. I really wanted to differentiate those characters. I wanted to have some similar traits from a warrior perspective, similar skill sets, but I want to differentiate them enough so a reader would also be able to differentiate them very quickly. Rafe he likes leather holsters with 1911s, and has a particular 1911 that was passed on from grandfather to father to him. Leather belt, boots that you'd wear over in Africa, the Courtneys, that sort of a thing. Likes the defenders more than the land users, like that sort of so all character development wise, and they could bring those skill sets to bear when necessary as a way to move the narrative forward. So that's where that came from.
That's cool.
And it wasn't that I hadn't read in another thriller, and I've read a lot of thrillers growing up. I was reading all the Tom Clancy's, all the Nelson DeMille's, all the A.J. Quinnell's, J.C. Pollock, Mark Olden, Stephen Hunter, all these guys that had these amazing books in the 80s with protagonists with backgrounds that I wanted in real life one day. So I knew that I was going to the SEAL teams very early in life, and then also knew that afterward I was going to write these kind of thrillers that I was enjoying. But in none of those thrillers can I think of one where someone had Rafe's background. So that's really where it came from. Knowing what was out there, because I'd done so much reading throughout my entire life, and then wanting to do something a little different, because a lot of those guys in the 80s, and even if people haven't read those books by those authors I just mentioned, if people watch TV in the 80s or movies,
for sure,
a lot of the backgrounds of those characters, they were Vietnam veterans. They were either Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Marine snipers, CIA paramilitary. That was kind of like their background. And now in the 80s, they were private investigators, they were police officers, they're a stuntman in the Fall Guys case. You know, they all had that kind of a background that would give them the skill sets necessary to do what they're doing on these TV shows and movies in the 80s. So that was my formative time in my youth. But Rafe came from that place where I wanted to have a character that wasn't familiar to readers or to people who grew up with film and television.
I thought you really nailed it too. Like, my brothers and I talk about this a lot, because that was a really formative time for us. We loved it there. We grew up playing rugby. We went to these certain schools, and like just the language, the way people talk, like when Rafe's talking with family and like the farms. Had you visited that area? Like, it's obviously you've traveled quite a bit, But
Yep.
did you ever go to Zim, or it sounds
I
like
went
you've done
to,
South Africa?
yeah, it's Mozambique, South Africa and
Hmm.
Mozambique. In the military, I went over to Mali. Yeah, in my private capacity, I went to Morocco before the military, Egypt before the military, Kenya before the military. Uh,
Jeez.
but yeah, Mozambique is where I went to actually do the
Cool.
research for this book, put boots on the ground. I had a few pages of questions for the professional hunters, and then for the trackers over there. And then I had a bunch of phrases that I wanted to get translated into local dialects.
Yeah.
So I didn't know how many there were, how many languages people spoke over there. I wanted to go and ask and find out. So I went there, spent a couple of weeks on the ground, did a Cape. It was essentially a Cape Buffalo hunt at the same time, and just looking at, hey, what is the rainy season like here? Okay, got it. What season are we in now? Okay, how do you get around during the rainy season? Do you get around during the rainy season?
Yeah.
What is that? How does this change? How does this foliage change? How does the dirt look a little different back then? This rock. What do you guys eat? What are Chinese mining operations, legal and illegal, doing here? How are they feeding them through poaching? The workers that are working in some of these mines, where are they doing that? Who's benefiting? All those sorts of things. I wanted to get that local flavor that I didn't really feel like I could get unless I put boots on the ground.
That's
So
cool.
for the first book, obviously, I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. The other places in the first book are places that I just happened to have been also, that I incorporated into the storylines. So while I was in the military, I'm not traveling around doing research
Yeah.
for a book, even though it was during my last year when I don't have much to do except get out of the military. So that's why Iraq, Afghanistan, that's the focus of the kind of the international side of the first book. And then the second one, even before I had a deal with Simon and Schuster, before I'd even sent it to Simon and Schuster, I was already on a plane to Mozambique, so I could write a second book. I always knew the story of John Grisham, who wrote A Time to Kill first and couldn't give that book away, and then writes The Firm, and then The Firm takes off, and then of course we have a John Grisham novel every year, but they republish A Time to Kill. Matthew McConaughey stars in that, and then we have a John Grisham novel every year. So I was very cognizant of that and thought, okay, if both of them don't work out though, then I'll start reevaluating and maybe think about some contingency planning. But I was always going to write two out of the gate, and I wanted that second one to be different than the first. So particularly so that critics or whoever else couldn't just say, oh, one trick pony, same thing, picked it up and dropped it in Africa, picked it up, dropped it in Europe, whatever. So I had to take that protagonist on a journey. And I was actually surprised once I got to that phase of getting the book picked up, first book picked up, and then turning in the second book, that my editor and publisher at Simon and Schuster, Emily Bessler, didn't cut out the first whole half of True Believer, because it's a journey. And
it's good.
I thought it would be disingenuous to the reader to not have the protagonist have to deal with some of the traumatic events in the first book and just them off. And now he's
just pop up.
He got our hero that we have, and now I drop him into this and that and that. But he needed to learn to live again, needed to find that mission, needed to find that purpose. And as I'm sure you saw in military and the other things that you've done, that some people have a hard time leaving that life behind. And even if they think they know what they're getting into on the outside, when they actually get there and find out that it's different, or they can't recreate some of those same feelings and emotions or drive that they had when they were a pilot or a SEAL or whatever else, they have a tough time with that. So I took some of that just from an observation standpoint, and I applied that to that second novel with my protagonist, James Reese, needing to learn how to live again, needing to find that next mission in life, find his purpose. And he does that off the grid in Mozambique, where he can apply some of those skill sets that he used in Iraq and Afghanistan to a poaching problem. And of course, as soon as he's learning to live again and embracing this life off the grid, that's when the CIA comes in, snatches him out, and drops him into his new problem set.
Awesome.
But yeah, I wanted to get the rugby in there. I hadn't really read a story where the protagonist or anybody is a rugby player. You get some other things in other novels, some other sports, but I hadn't seen rugby yet. And I like the international flavor of
totally.
Play it all around the world, so I can bring that in. And so that's where it came from. And he's a fan favorite for sure. So we get to learn a little bit more about him in this next series with Amazon, both the spinoff and True Believer. So it'll be interesting to see what the casting looks like.
That is cool.
That right now.
And I think I saw him maybe on your website, like you driving around in a Defender. I don't.
Was I in a Defender recently? Where was I in a Defender?
Well, it looked like Maybe it's just a cool intro, like drone shot they did of you in the outdoors, but it looked
Oh
like
yeah,
you
yeah,
were
that's an
cruising
old
in a
one. Yeah, I
Defender.
borrowed a friend's Defender, Defender 110. That's it's a nice one.
I love it.
Whoever sells it, I'm first in line. But I don't have it yet, but it's a really nice one. So yeah, I used that in
Got it.
that first book trailer video for the first novel, and also used it in the Savage Son video trailer as well.
All right, and obviously you're doing a book tour, and we'll touch on not just the characters, the book, but also your own experience. One of the things, it sounds like you're incredibly well read, Jack. I'm trying to imagine you at Buds, like you got this big beam on your chest, you're doing sit ups or whatever, you got the boat over your head, and if you look to your right and told these other guys, like, "Hey, I'm going to be a writer one day,"
Oh
like, what I don't know what the reaction would have been, but I feel like that's not the first thing that comes to mind for a SEAL.
no, you don't lead with it. That's for sure. I know I never told anybody in the SEAL teams. My wife knew, we've known each other since we were 18. So she's known, my parents have known, but I didn't really share it outside that circle, probably because, it's the same thing as like if you tell somebody you want to be an astronaut one day, or you want to be a SEAL one day when you're young, they kind of look at you with, even if they don't say it, you can kind of see the look in their
Yeah,
eyes. Oh, that's like if you want to be everybody wants to be a firefighter when a firefighter, a cowboy, a cop, an astronaut, like, that race car driver. Like those are like when you're 5, 6, like those are the things, at least when we grew up, those were kind of the cores that you wanted to be. And then you do. A lot of people do grow out of that. And I never did. I never grew out of wanting to serve my country in uniform as a SEAL, which I found out about when I was 7, and then wanting to write thrillers, which I also found, which I think it was about age. So by age 10, I started reading the things my parents were reading, but I was still reading young adult stuff at the same time. And then by 6th grade, for sure, I was only reading the same kind of novels at the same level that I am today. So by 6th grade, age 11, and that's because my mom was a librarian, and I grew up with
oh
surrounded
geez.
love of reading. And so I got very fortunate that reading was a natural part of my life growing up. It wasn't something I was forced to do, something I had to do. It was just as natural as sitting down to dinner or doing anything else, going on a hike. Reading was just a part of the daily routine. And it would never occur to me that, oh, this is being forced upon me. It is something that we do as humans, as a family. And I think reading all those books without the lens of and cynicism that comes along with age and experience was magical because I didn't have those filters in place yet. And I'm an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old, and I'm reading these amazing books by the masters. And I don't really realize that what it is doing is giving me an education in the art of storytelling from the fan's perspective. But I'm not having those words get filtered through my experience,
Yeah.
or else it might be to be like, oh, this could never happen. Psh, that sort of a thing, or I can do this better, and like it was just magic in those pages. So, and now some of those guys like Stephen Hunter and David Morrell, David Morrell created Rambo back in 1972 with First Blood. They're friends now. So I
That is cool.
email and talk to those guys fairly frequently. And they're just fantastic. But now it's me wanting to introduce more people to their work, which is kind of crazy because I think it's so incredible, and I wish more people would read in general, but read their stuff in particular if people are reading thrillers. But yeah, reading in
Yeah.
general, I promote as much as I possibly can with my book club or through my podcast or through the author's note in my books or whatever else it might be, reading lists and the rest of it, because I do get a lot of questions about it. But it essentially built the foundation for all of my life, not just this, but being a SEAL, not just being a SEAL, but being the best operator I could possibly be, because I'm not just reading these thrillers growing up. I'm also reading all the nonfiction I possibly can on counterinsurgencies and insurgencies and special operations and warfare and terrorism. I'm reading books, I'm reading articles, I'm reading the newspaper, watching any sort of documentary that comes out, but I'm building this foundation so that I can be the best operator and best leader that I possibly can, because I've been building this up over a lifetime. So I think no matter what industry someone wants to get into, having a foundation that's built upon an understanding of history in whatever segment of society or industry you want to get into is only beneficial. So
Yeah.
promote reading as much as I possibly can. But no, that was a very long way of saying I did not leave the SEAL teams and never told anybody in the SEAL teams that that I was going to write, because as soon as you say that, especially after some of the books came out after the Bin Laden raid type deal, that and the movie came out, Act of Valor, a couple of years before that, and it was just, we hit a tipping point. And if people didn't like Richard Marcinko's books, they certainly didn't like these other books that were coming out, not in real time, but in fairly close to the time the events occurred. So there was already like this look down on that in the SEAL teams in general, even though Warcom promoted and encouraged and gave their blessing to some of those books and the movie. But regardless, it wasn't something that I was going to talk about. That was just, I knew what I wanted to do next. I'd been preparing for it my whole life, but I knew that I had to be a SEAL first, because you're going to get older and you can't do it. You have a certain amount of, you have to, you're going to serve your country in uniform. Makes sense to be a SEAL first, and then to
natural order of things.
Yeah. But I didn't do one. I didn't really think of it in terms of, I thought of them as two distinctly different things growing up. I didn't think of them in terms of how much being in the military would help build upon that foundation, both academic and free reading, for lack of a better, how that would all come together as I got out. I thought of them as distinctly different until I actually sat down and started to, not just the theme or the one-page executive summary, not even the outline, but when I started turning that outline into the narrative, right away I realized how, and it's not just how personal of a writing experience it was going to be, but it wasn't just that, I'm going to get the sniper weapon systems right, and if I don't know, or if I've forgotten, I can reach out to somebody who really lives in that world and knows all these specifics and details. It wasn't just that. That was just kind of like a given, but that's what I thought would be beneficial as I stepped into the space, into publishing. But what really, I think, has differentiated these books, and what really became evident to me, even at the first sentence, was how much of the feelings and emotions behind certain things were going to end up in the pages of the novel. And that's something I didn't anticipate, because it wasn't in my one page. It wasn't in my thought process as I was trying to think about how to start down this path. It wasn't in my one-page executive summary or multiple page executive summary. It wasn't in the outline. It only came out after I started writing. And one of those is an ambush in Baghdad, but in 2006. And so I don't have to go out there and track down someone who's been in an ambush and then ask that person questions and then filter those answers through other interviews I've done or other interviews I've seen conducted, through documentaries or histories or whatever it might be, through other books, both fiction and non, through films I've seen, through what I just think it would be like to be in an ambush. No, it all comes from actually being in one and then thinking back to that time and then taking those feelings and emotions and applying them directly to a completely fictional narrative. So James Reese, let's say, gets ambushed in the mountains of Montana or on a street in Los Angeles, California. I go back and I remember what it was like to be in Baghdad in 2006 and actually be ambushed. And then I take that and I put this into the fictional narrative. So I think that stood out to Simon & Schuster and has stood out to readers. And it's also very, therapeutic. I got very fortunate with my time in uniform that my decisions under fire, for whatever reason, worked out. But it's very therapeutic in the sense that you see how these things ended. And you see the decisions at the strategic level, essentially, that were made along the way. And instead of just being upset about those things, I can now work them into this fictional narrative and turn them into a positive for the book, maybe educational for somebody who is reading it, who wants to understand what it's like from a warrior's perspective, who kicked in those doors and who lost friends and who knows people that are missing arms and legs or dealing with traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress or, whatever, alcoholism or dependency on Ambien or that caustic cocktail of all these things together. That's the part that's real. The other side, and I've gotten some things are real, have come to fruition, like Russia invading Ukraine, which I put into the second believer. There's this artificial intelligence thing with quantum computing that I put in to the last novel, and now it's all over the news with the ChatGPT and all this other stuff. And of course, I work in some bioweapons stuff that's come to fruition as well. I shouldn't say fruition, has been exposed in news. So there are those things out there as well. But yeah, I love writing, and I've always loved writing, and I always knew what I was going to do, and inadvertently gave myself an education in it along the way.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, and we'll get right back to this combat story. As you know, I live in California, where we can have earthquakes and fires, and I grew up in Florida with hurricanes. I know firsthand how natural disasters can quickly and unexpectedly put me and my family in a position where we have to hunker down, shelter in place, and sometimes without power, so I always want to have food available. You can create your own stockpile of the best-selling 4 Patriots Survival Food Kits. It's not ordinary food. We're talking good for 25 years super survival food. Handpicked right in a family-owned facility in the U.S., giving jobs to over 200 Americans, which we love. The kits are compact, sturdy, water-resistant, and stack easily. They have different delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and you can make these meals in less than 20 minutes. Just add boiling water, simmer, and serve. And right now, you can go to 4patriots.com and use the code COMBAT to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including their 3-month survival kit. You'll get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. They're called 4 Patriots because a portion of every sale is donated to charities who support our veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com and use COMBAT to get 10% off. That's the number 4patriots.com. Use the code COMBAT and start building your own stockpile today. And now, back to this combat story. So, I think you also nailed the relationships in there for anybody who's been like in combat with other people, like the bond that's created. I think you do a really good job of teasing that out and giving people that perspective. And it's very hard to replicate that if you haven't been involved in those events. So I'm curious what a 7-year-old version of you, what did you see or read that made you think like, yeah, I need to go be a SEAL one day?
Yeah, well, I first part is a 7-year-old me is very similar to of this age me, but I still have friends from in those days from when I was 5, 6, 7, and they're like, hey, you are still the exact same person you were on the playground back then. That's kind of cool to have friends from back in the day that and those type of friends knew that I wanted to be a SEAL and knew that I wanted to write, like people that I've known since I was 5, 6, 7 time frame. But my grandfather was killed in World War II. He was a Corsair pilot, Marine pilot. So he flew the Corsair, which had the gull wings for those listening or watching that they fold up so you could fit them on the aircraft carrier. So I grew up knowing that he was a Marine pilot. I grew up with his wings, his medals, black and white photos of him and his squadron. I am standing outside on the wing of his aircraft. The silk maps they would give aviators back then, because if you hit the water with a paper map, it would just disintegrate, but a silk map just gets wet, still works. So I had all that stuff. And then back then there was no way to track down anyone who was a part of, let's say, my father had no way to find someone that had served with his dad. There wasn't a Facebook, there wasn't anything like that. These guys were in the middle of a war, and there was maybe one letter that arrived to his mom, and that was it. A telegram, that's it. It wasn't like people would track, at least in his case, track down to say, oh, hey, I knew your father. He was an amazing pilot, a great guy. Just want to pass some things on to you. Like that, guys came home and got back to work. And so he didn't have any touch points other than those physical objects, any connection to his dad. But we both had Black Sheep Squadron on TV, starring Robert Conrad portraying Pappy Boynton. And I had Pappy Boynton's autobiography, which I read. I met Pappy Boynton before he passed away. And so that was our touch point with that generation. And we'd watch the World War II movies. So that was a connection to that generation. So it was very natural for me to, and I think it was in my DNA anyway, even without any of that. I think I would have been drawn to military service, but it was just a natural thing for me to want to do as a protector and as just a person. I just knew I was going to serve my country in uniform. And then I found out about SEALs. So I didn't know, I knew the military, anything that was in a movie that was really at age 5, 6, 7, that's where you're getting these inputs. And you're seeing like Force 10 from Navarone or that sort of thing. You're like, okay, that's kind of Dirty Dozen. Like, okay, what small group stuff always appealed to me for whatever reason. And at age 7, I found out about SEALs because my dad would watch football on Sundays, and there was the 4 channels. There was ABC, CBS, NBC, and then an outlier. An outlier channel on Sundays always had a World War II movie on. So when commercial time came, I was the remote control. And for those who grew up 70s and 80s, they know that the kids, you were the remote. And so I'd go up and I'd flip it to that outlier. You're not flipping through a bunch of channels. You're like 2 clicks and you're on that outlier channel. And I'd get to watch, my dad would look at his watch, and for 2.5 or 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes, I get to watch that movie and then switch it back to football. And one of those movies was The Frogman. And black and white film showed these guys coming up on beaches and putting explosives on these obstacles. And asked my dad who they were, and he said The Frogmen. And I'm like, well, who are they? And he said, ask your mother. So my mom being a librarian, we went down to the local library and did some research, and I found out about SEALs. I found out about underwater demolition teams. And so that my takeaway at age 7 from the very limited amount of material that was out there at the time was that, hey, SEALs are some of the most elite special operators in the world, and the training is some of the toughest ever devised by a modern military. At least that's what was out there in print at the time, and most of those articles would connect back to Vietnam. That was a watershed period in special operations history, particularly in the SEAL teams and in Army Special Forces. So I was in age 7, I'm going to be a SEAL one day. And so everything I did from that point on, I always think about, hey, how is this going to benefit me later on, as I want to be a warrior. I want to be a leader. I'm going to go downrange and serve my country in uniform in combat.
Yeah.
So everything I really did, whether it was what I was reading or what I was doing physically, whether I was playing soccer or running cross country, or whatever it was, I was always thinking like, this is to get me in shape for, and I think it's been like that since the beginning of time. You're playing these things so that you can be in shape for the hunt.
Yeah.
In shape for to defend your tribe from another tribe. Like, that's just a very natural thing for young men in particular to do, to develop these skill sets, is through sport. So so it's I guess, so young me was very, I guess, driven. I didn't really think of it like that at the time. I just thought, oh, I want to be a SEAL one day. I should probably do some pull-ups, like that. It was just common sense, right? It wasn't, I didn't need to, there's nothing to get online and say, hey, what do I need to do? It was just, oh, I saw this little video over here. It shows some people climbing a cargo net, showed some guys swimming. Oh, I should probably swim, and I should probably climb some ropes. So that was me from a very early age.
Man, it's amazing the influence that books and Hollywood have on our decisions to join the military. That's a key takeaway after interviewing 120 vets. Like, it was important for me, but it's pretty prevalent throughout. So I got to imagine when that's the path that you want to go on. I know you go on to lead larger units, task force, platoon, but you start out enlisted, which I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, I almost feel like that's a superpower. And especially just getting your hands on, like you were talking about, do I still remember like some of the details of the weapons and the sights and that sort of thing? But I think when you're on the enlisted side, you're just around that more. Like, you really have to be so proficient with that. Was the intent like, how can I just get in as soon as possible? Like, I'm going to enlist and just get my foot in the door.
That was part of it, but also, that became, when you're watching those movies as a kid, I'm not really understanding the differences between a commissioned officer and a non-commissioned officer, or you're just seeing like, for the Army guys go out, you're not really
true.
I wasn't, what the sergeant kind of is, but you still, in your GI Joe figures on the back, you're still, I wasn't anyway. You're seeing, warrant officer, you're seeing sergeant, you're seeing general or whatever, but it's kind of all lumped in as you're looking at your GI Joe figures and watching these movies. It didn't really click until later, maybe closer to the end of high school, where I'm kind of like, oh, okay, I'm getting this now. And then Richard Marcinko's book comes out, and then he really talks about the difference between an officer and enlisted. And other books and films I had seen hadn't really, like, it had just been a part of it, but it wasn't articulated as this is the difference. And Richard Marcinko's book, first one, really did do that. And so I was like, oh, now I get it. Now I understand what I've been watching for the last 20 years or whatever it was. I guess I wasn't watching it when I was 1, 2, 3 years old, but I just, from the beginning of
close enough.
Cognitive, throughout my younger years, watching TV, movies, reading books. Now I get it, because he does not like officers. He becomes one later. But so I started figuring out, oh, okay, I want to be a sniper one day, and officers aren't snipers. Got it. Okay. And enlisted guys are doing the job. They're they're building these charges, they are blowing these doors, whatever it was. Like, so that really, Richard Marcinko's book really did cement that for me for whatever reason, probably because of the age I was at when it came out, and having that background where I kind of didn't quite get it yet because I couldn't talk to anybody. You couldn't like get online or ask a question to somebody
No.
on Instagram. That stuff didn't exist. So you're just like kind of taking it in, like, ooh, okay. And like so anyway, I always wanted to be enlisted after I figured that out. Going to start enlisted for sure. Going to become a sniper, or at least try to become a sniper. I want that skill set, and then later I'll decide if I want to become an officer or not. And ended up going that route. Did 6.5 years enlisted, then became an officer, right back to the SEAL teams, and just kept going, charging the whole way. So I got very fortunate in that I got to stay operational for a lot longer than if someone came in just as an officer. Got a couple maybe the troop commander after that, but I didn't really go into a staff job. I went to Europe for gosh, it wasn't even a year. I just had to get back to the teams. I've just been working with the agency in Iraq, and I was kind of, I guess, off the grid as far as being a part of the military hierarchy, because I was the only military guy attached to a covert action program over there, and had such an amazing experience with those guys. I was actually going to go over there because they're like, "Oh, now's your time in your officer career."
I'm sure. Yeah.
Like, and I'm going to the agency, and I actually dropped my papers to go. Had a class update for the farm. The whole thing. Did my lifestyle poly and the medical and the briefings and all. Did all of it. And then at the last second, the military was like, "All right, why don't you Splot just opened up miraculously at a SEAL platoon, and we'd like you to stay and come take over the SEAL platoon." And I hadn't even anticipated that as being an option. I was 100% getting out.
Wow.
Be a counter offer. I'm like, you want to get out, you just leave. You drop your papers and you go. A few months later, or whatever it is. But they had offered a platoon spot for me, so I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll think about that now. And then decided to stay to get back in the fight as a platoon commander. So I figured they'd invested some time, money, whatever in me.
Yeah.
And as a platoon commander, it's a cool position. So ended up doing that, and then ended up just staying in. And then it became evident to me after I got back from my last Iraq deployment that it was time to get out, take care of my family. That would be the last one where I would tactically maneuver guys in the battlefield. I became a troop commander, task unit commander. So after that, yeah, you can come back as a commanding officer at some day, but you're going to be in a tactical operations center. You're going to be allocating assets. You're not going to be, and the guys don't want you out there by that point.
No, they don't.
Dated. Yeah, your skill set is dated by that point, and you have not done the workup with them, and your job is to be back in that tactical operations center. But I knew that wasn't that's not what I came in to do, and my family. Yeah. And we have 3 kids, one with pretty severe special needs, and it was clear that it was time to get out. So got back from that deployment, and I didn't really make that decision until I got back from that deployment. Looked around, looked at my family, looked at that career path ahead, and was like, "Oh, all right, got a couple years left." They're sending me to Buds to be the operations officer, which is essentially like a COO at a company for anyone listening or watching. And then that's when I took a breath and said, "Oh, time to get out, and it's time to write." So that was the progression there.
I just got to say, like the enlisted side probably gave you so much rich material that you would not have had you just gone straight officer track to write the way you do and with the authenticity. And I think that's a big takeaway as I read these. You can tell it's written by a veteran, somebody who's been there. And you'd mentioned, I didn't know this, but like you mentioned the ambush in 2006. Would you mind just diving into 1 or 2 experiences you had downrange that were kind of like formative and helped shape some of what you end up writing about later? Obviously nothing classified, but just the experience that you had in those moments.
Yeah, people think that just because you were a SEAL or whatever, or attached to the agency, that you know a lot of classified stuff, and it's really not the case. It's what we did downrange, at least me, at least the people I was with, is exact same thing that most big city SWAT teams are going to do tonight. Like, they're going to serve a warrant, and they're going to go into some neighborhood somewhere, and they're going to have a person that has violated parole or done something that they need to bring back in, and they're going to do either a knock or a no knock warrant, and they're going to take this person and bring them back and put them back into the justice system. That's essentially what we did downrange. Is we had a few more assets at our disposal, and we had a little more air cover up there, and but even in these big city SWAT teams, things. There's helicopters and lights and nods and explosive breaching in some cities, some not in others. But very similar. Point being, you're manhunting and you're putting together a pattern of life, and you're waiting for a trigger, meaning you don't want to go to this person's house if they're not there, just because they're usually there. Well, you have to know that they're there. Same thing downrange. So it wasn't that much classified type stuff. It was just in Baghdad or wherever else that we were doing it. So yeah, that ambush was impactful, I would say, because the reason we ended up in it, and I talk about this in the first book as a memory, as my protagonist is walking to a meeting, essentially, where he's going to take somebody off the board, and he's he's reminded of the streets around where this took place, and that was a real thing. And I was with, I don't know much about your background, you go on to on the podcast, but anyway, it was with that group, and we ended up being in this position because we couldn't go into a mosque. Even though we tracked our guy there through both technical means and human means. So we knew he was there, and we had Iraqis with us, but we'd gotten in trouble a couple of weeks prior. So I was on the radio trying to wake up probably a colonel. I say general, but it was probably like a colonel or somebody who probably then had to wake up the general it had to go up pretty high in 2006 to get permission for Americans to go in to a mosque after someone. Anyway, regardless, so we're in the street for longer because we didn't know that he was going there. And anyway, that gives the enemy time to come up. And this was around the time of the just after the Golden Mosque bombing. So it's essentially civil war going on between Sunni and Shia.
Jack, what's your role in this? Like, are you enlisted at the time? Are you an officer now? Like, where are you in your progression?
I'm a junior officer at this point.
Okay.
So just tasked over to the agency for the specific mission set, I guess you'd call it. But so I had the longer hair, didn't have to shave. It was fantastic. I absolutely loved it. Mission planning and mission approvals were so much more efficient. And other people might have had other experiences. Just my experience at that time with the personalities in place. And it was very efficient. I didn't have to walk it through because I had a CIA staff person that did that was attached to this unit, walk it through for approvals. And I was there for battlefield deconfliction because there were multiple battle spaces out there that we would have to just drive through to get to our targets. So we had to make sure that they knew we were coming, that they knew what our profile was, that they had a QRF, a quick reaction force, for those listening, on a certain level of standby, whether it was in the vehicles, engine running, ready to rock, or it was, hey, be able to get in those vehicles in a few minutes, or there was different levels of preparedness as we were either moving through or conducting an operation in a certain battle space. So that was my job, was really to deconflict that battle space with the different battle space owners, and provide them the next day with after actions, like what we did, so that they wouldn't be walking in with a conventional force or driving in with a conventional force after we just blew the door off somebody's house and had a huge gunfight in the streets. And so anyway, my job was to then let the battle space owner and let the theater essentially know what we had done. And then it was tactical communications as we would move to and from the target. So, hey, we're coming into your battle space, and just let those QRF people know and be on the right frequency and do all that stuff. And my enlisted days, I was a communicator, so I had the radios down and that sort of a thing. So, and then it was just to be a shooter. So it was fantastic. It was amazing. Absolutely. And the chow hall over there at the agency was pretty dang good.
I've heard this. Yeah.
The best steaks I ever had in my life was there, actually. I don't know why, but it was. And then the coffee the coffee was amazing over there. I think I've worked that into a couple novels, but it's distinctly to this day, I can't recreate that type of coffee. I don't know, it was maybe the horrible styrofoam cups added to the type of coffee, added to the exact sweetener and creamer that they had with the air and the ambiance and the camaraderie and everything else that went into making that coffee so good. I don't know what it was, but it stands out to me. It stands out to me to this day.
So you were getting set for this mosque hit, basically.
We didn't know leaving. We were just tracking someone with some technical and human means both, and he ended up going into the mosque before we could get him.
Okay, and you got ambushed during this event?
while we're waiting to go in. Yeah. So we have to, because we got in trouble a couple of weeks prior, and me being the only military attached, now I'm on the horn trying to wake up this person who probably needs to wake up people up and down the chain
Yeah.
in order to go get this person. Anyway, in that time, just whether it was an actual militia attached to this guy or just the neighborhood, the profile of our vehicles, which was different, I'll just say, than some of the other like military style convoys that they had been used to, so close to the Golden Mosque bombing. Anyway, it seemed like the whole neighborhood came out and got into buildings. And actually, a buddy who I hadn't talked to in years, and I say buddy because we went through so much during that time frame, just reached out recently and tracked me down through an FBI buddy of his who reconnected us after all these years. And we got to, that's why it's top of mind right now, just because we got
Yeah.
to relive it. And he got to ask me, "Do you remember this? Do you remember that?" And we had a great time catching up. And he's still at in that organization. Thanks.
Got it. Dang. Um, are there other moments when you were downrange that really kind of that maybe you use still to kind of ground yourself when you're writing, and like, wow, this is what some intense moments felt like, or like an operation where you thought things could go sideways before you went in? Anything like that come to mind that you still leverage?
Yeah, and a few different levels. One level being, let's call it the strategic level, where I'm solving problems aggressively on the written page, the same way I would on the battlefield. But I have a lot more time when I'm writing because it's all about problem solving. As I'm writing these stories, even if I have it outlined, there are certain things where I've just moved on in the outline and not spent a month trying to figure out in outline form, knowing that I have a year and a few months, whatever it might be, to solve that problem. So I don't want to get hung up on something that I know over time I'll be able to figure out. Battlefield, you don't have that. You got to make decisions in seconds, and people's lives are in your hands. And you're still capitalizing on momentum. You're still looking for gaps in the enemy's defenses. You are still adapting just as the enemy's adapting to you. So I'm doing all that on the written page. So I think at the strategic level, generally how I operated downrange as a leader, whether it was under fire or mission planning or whatever else, I take that same mindset and then I apply that as I'm writing. But I don't have the same level of stress because I know if I screw this up on the written page, the worst that's going to happen is a horrible review and no one's going to buy it. And that's okay. No one's done. And I always thought my responsibility, even before I joined the military, that's why I did so much reading and so much training, was to be the best operator and best leader I could possibly be, because that's what I owed the person to my right and left, to their families, to the team, the country, to the mission. And as I'm writing these books, I still have a responsibility, obviously, to my reader who is trusting me with time they're never going to get back, which is why I take it so seriously, put so much time into it. And whether it's the book or a blog post or even a social media post, as much thought goes into any one of those sentences as to the other, because people are trusting me with this time that they've chosen to spend it with me, and they're never getting that back. So that's the strategic level of how downrange and combat operations affects my writing. Then at the tactical level, yes, I'll go back to those certain instances like that ambush, or like what it's like to be a sniper, or one of the larger events that I was involved with downrange was the campaign to retake the city of Najaf in the summer of 2004, in August of 2004, from the Jaish al-Mahdi militia. And it was as close to those World War II movies that I watched with my dad as anything else that I did downrange, because most of the time we're choosing the time and place of the engagement. Typically that's in the middle of the night, and you're landing on the X in the early days, you're offset infill later on, or whatever else, because you're always adapting, enemies always adapting, and whoever does that faster typically comes out on top. But it was a 2-week campaign, and I might be off by a few days. It's been a couple of years now. It's been almost 20 years now, which is crazy to think
Yep,
about.
I know.
My part in it was 11 days. And so I had a sniper team that I took in there, and it was day, it was night. We were there in support of Big Army. I think I can say his name now, Colonel Rainey. Hopefully he became a general. I have no idea, but he was in charge of 27 Cav at the time. So I just went in there and said, "Hey, sir, here's the capabilities we're bringing to bear here as snipers and as TACs, so controlling close air support, for people listening. Here's what we can do. How can we help?" And essentially we just got out there on that front line, and then would push forward of that front line, bring up the Bradleys, bring up the Abrams, bring in the air, work together with 27 Cav and with elements of the National Guard. Like, so many people were put together in different units and thrown together for this multi-week operation, essentially. But it was amazing because we're running through the streets, middle of the day. The fighting didn't stop at night. And it just we kept pushing the enemy back, and then they'd take positions, we'd take positions, we'd bring up that water, because for those who've been in Iraq or were in Najaf in the summer of 2004, it's pretty warm out there. So you're bringing up water, you're bringing up food, you're bringing up ammo, you have that Army logistics train, and you're talking at these senior levels of, hey, where are we going to put the Bradleys? Okay, we're going to do this here. We'll dump you guys off here. You guys take positions here. Abrams will come in over here. We have some air. Let's push them back by another couple streets. We'll take up these positions, plural, and then we'll bring that logistics train up for support, and then fight for a day or two, and then constantly evaluating, and then push forward again. So they all got pushed back to the Imam Ali Mosque, which is a very historic mosque in Islam, and then of course, once we did all that, there was a peace treaty negotiated at the senior levels of the Iraqi government. And anyway, after we pushed them all the way back there, after these 11, well, it was 2 weeks, but my part was 11 days. Essentially, we ended up hunting them down again years and years later. So that's just how it goes. Really typical.
You know, it's especially when I'm interviewing someone like you, Jack. I think it's easy for people listening, looking in from the outside, to be like, geez, this guy did however many years, you know, like a career as a SEAL, successful, has written, you know, coming up on 6 books here. Anything this guy touches turns to gold. Like, is there any, you know, I'm sure you think back on some times where you could have done better, but like, just to give people some ease of like, hey, not everything's perfect here. What comes to mind for you in your time in service? Like, that one didn't go the way I wanted.
Yeah, I mean, I got extremely lucky. And if anything didn't go the way, not that you want it to go, but you want to make sure that you are making the best decision possible for your guys, and you don't want to have that ever come back and question if you could have prepared a little more. So I think that's why I put so much time in. And even in the military, people think that, especially in special operations, they think that you're out there training all the time, which you are, but you're doing 2 weeks of air operations. You're doing 3 weeks of diving. You're going up to, let's say, Fort Lewis in the winter, and you're jumping in, and you're just kind of moving through terrain where there is, the ground is frozen and it's raining. You're doing mobility training. We're learning how to fight with vehicles. And guess what you haven't done now for the last 2.5, 3 months, because of all those things I just mentioned? Well, you haven't placed a breaching charge on a door and entered and done your CQC. So I was always, even on if there was a weekend, I would go out and I would train, would see who's passing through, let's say Riverside at a range, and
wow,
Larry Vickers is coming through, or Pat McNamara is coming through, or I'm going up to Thunder Ranch first in Texas and then in Oregon, just to keep my skills sharp. Or, hey, what new books are out there, whether it's strategic, operational, or tactical focused? What can I be reading right now to make myself a better leader? And when I talk about the strategic level stuff, why did you need to do that as a tactical level leader? And that's because you need to filter things that come down from on high to that E2, E3, E4, E5, who might not be too thrilled with the fact that, I don't know, you can't do night operations, or whatever it is. Or, hey, why is Iraq worse now than last year when we were here? And, we lost a guy, or this happened, or that happened. And you have to, as a leader, not just say, shut up and move on. And I think the misconception about the military is,
yeah,
you do what you do because someone tells you to. And at least that's not my experience. My experience, both in the military and in publishing, both very small. The very sliver of those entire industries, for lack of a better term. But you do things because you trust the person above you or below you in the chain of command. So trust was always a very important part of that for me. And I didn't think about it in those terms at the time, but that's what I was doing. So that when someone has a question, or when I'm not just a conduit for senior level leaders' directives, I mean, otherwise just post it on the board. The art of leadership then is being able to translate those things and give the why behind those things, so that that tactical level unit can do the job and isn't wasting bandwidth, either worried about, or worried about is not the right term.
Yeah, they don't have to think about it.
What's like, why are we doing this type
Yeah.
of, so that's the art side of it. Eventually you got to get out there and do the job and crush it each and every time. But you also have to, as a leader, figure out how to socialize and articulate some of those higher senior level directives, strategic level initiatives, to that tactical level, in a way that makes sense and keeps people inspired and moving forward. So that's why I'm reading all those different things, just like tactically, not just like, oh, what is the enemy doing with their IEDs now? Okay, well, this is what we're going to do then. And then how are they going to change that? Why is it going to happen while we're in theater? Do they have that capability? That's, if I was the enemy, what would I be doing if we introduce this new countermeasure or this new tactic or this new technology? And that's the tactical level type stuff. And you're always doing that as well. But you need to be well versed in the operational and strategic levels at the same time, because that helps build trust. And if I'm going out there on the weekends and I'm shooting and I get out there on the range as a senior level leader, not senior level, senior tactical level leader, I guess, with the guys, and they're like, oh man, our task unit commander is out here and he beat like everyone except one of our guys with a, running the stress course. Oh man, when you don't have to, or, hey, we're going to have to run it on the obstacle course. And it's fairly typical for senior level people to be like, oh, I have a meeting. Because you do have meetings a lot of times. But you got to get out there. I always thought, hey, because it's not just an opportunity for me to stay in shape and run the obstacle course. No, it is that, but it's also a way to continue to build trust with the guys, because they see you out there. You don't have to be, and you're out there and you're crushing it and you're beating most of them. And that is pretty cool. And it's time spent with those guys you're going to take down. You're getting to know them at the same time, and you're building this trust. So it's so I put a lot of work into that, but I didn't look at it as work. It was just natural, I guess. But what was, I guess, work isn't, but I guess it was natural as well, was to socialize that with my wife, with the family. Like, you have to that the pendulum is on the side of the team. It is not on the side of the family. And I think being direct about that, for us anyway, I mean, every situation is going to be different. So hopefully people just don't go out and say this and then all of a sudden you have another slew of divorces, whatever. But for us, it worked for me to be able to be honest and say that the pendulum is on the side of the team.
Yeah.
Because that's what I owe these guys. That's what I owe their families. It has to be there. So I have to be training. I have to be studying. I have to be making myself a better operator and a leader constantly. And that's going to hurt the family. But guess what? I'm taking these guys to Afghanistan. I'm taking these guys to Iraq, wherever you're going. Eventually, but you don't need to be like a hard ass about it. You can say, eventually that will come back. Eventually that pendulum will come back when I don't have people's lives in my hands anymore. And so as we got closer to getting out, then, you talk about that too. And the pendulum's going to swing back to the family side. So anyways, I guess
That's
it's
great.
all been in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I was going to say your wife probably loved that you were like gone for 3 weeks of air ops, 2 weeks of diving, and then you got to see Pat Mack on the weekend. She's probably like, that sounds great.
Yeah, she was very understanding. Thank goodness. But it's but I think talking about it, not just doing it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great call.
They understand, or not lying. And some people might be lying to themselves also about it, about where that pendulum is. I think that can create probably more tension than just having a discussion about it and being open and honest about it, but also being open and honest about the future as well. Like, hey, this isn't always going to be the case. This will swing back. At least that's my plan.
Yeah. So as you were talking about this, the training cycle that I think a lot of, veterans are familiar with, like 3 weeks out here, 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there. How do you apply that and staying really dialed into what, like, tactics, strategic, operational, tactical level? How do you apply that, if at all, to writing? I don't know if you do, or if writing's just more of a fluid endeavor for you.
Yeah, I don't know if I apply, or at least I haven't thought about it in those terms yet, other than having a mission. And now my mission is to, well, on the personal side, is to take care of my family, be the best husband and father I can possibly be, and be better at those things each and every day. Just like I want to be a better writer today than I was yesterday. For my next book, I want to be better than I was for this book. And that's just, I think that's very just natural as humans, no matter what you're doing, to want to get better at it. But in this case, I have that added responsibility of people's time that they're investing with me. So I haven't really thought about it in these terms before, but if any of that mission planning or training cycle did play in it, I didn't clock it I didn't clock it as such. But if I think about it in these terms, for each of the books, I have had a very similar process. So if you're looking at a workup as a process, then yes, I have a process for the books, and I want that to get better, more effective, more efficient going forward always as well. But it is a process, and it's has remained the same, but I didn't get it from anywhere. I just got it from, so maybe it did come from mission planning and workups, because I just thought, oh, naturally, it makes sense to start with a theme, a title, and a one-page executive summary. So for the first one, I had about 6, 7, 8, 9 different executive summaries on the table. And one of those was Savage Son, and that's the one I wanted to start with. But I knew that the characters weren't developed enough to explore the theme of Savage Son.
Wow.
Was,
That's book 3, right? I mean, it becomes book 3.
Yeah, that's book 3.
Wow.
It's the dark side of man explored through the dynamic of hunter and hunted. And I always wanted to write that book since I read Most Dangerous Game back in 6th grade.
That's great. Yeah.
Short story or novella by Richard Connell from the early 1920s. And so even back then in the 6th grade, I told myself that one day I'd write a thriller that paid tribute to that short story. And that was Savage Son.
That's cool.
I wanted to start there, but I knew the characters weren't developed enough to explore those themes in a way that was that would be, I don't know, that would be the best that I could possibly do it. So it was very clear. Terminalist, out of all these things I have written down, Terminalist is the one to start. I had the title right away. I heard Stephen Pressfield talking about having a theme, even though I misinterpreted what he said. What I thought he said was that he had a one-word theme that was a guide for all his books. But what he was really doing, he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he said he was telling a story about a playwright in New York that would write a few sentences down that would guide the play as he wrote the screenplay.
But you used one word, is what you're saying. What was it for that?
Revenge. And then I changed it to revenge without constraint very, very early on. So I thought I was cheating a little bit. And only later, when I become friends with Stephen Pressfield, did I figure out that I misinterpreted what he said, because I told him that story. And then I re-listened to it on Rogan, and sure enough, he was right. But I'm glad I misinterpreted that. Second one was redemption, and then I added violent redemption to it. So each one has had a theme. Each one has had the title, because I don't want to waste any bandwidth worried about the title. I've had great titles up to this point. I don't want to be worried about, as I'm writing, oh, geez, I'm never going to be able to think of a good title for this. I want to have that title down, even if it's a working title. And then those one-page executive summaries that I have, now I ask myself a question. Now I write those one-page executive summaries out, and I ask myself, hey, is this worth the next year and a half of my life? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I read it again, and I say, if someone were to pick up this book and read the back of it, or read the inside flap jacket, would they be willing to invest time that they're never going to get back in this story? And if the answer to that is yes, or probably, then I go forward, and then this is the next book. So in terms of thinking of a workup being a process to get you ready for a deployment, that deployment being the end state, or being as prepared as you possibly can for combat, then yes, that process is there in a similar way that a workup is getting ready. But in this case, it's art, and meaning it's subjective. And that means metrics are skewed based on personal experience and preferences and all the rest of it. But it's very similar to, I would think, having a painting, having a sculpture, and you work on it for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is. And then you have everyone gather around, and they're like, we've seen it in movies growing up. And then they pull the curtain away or pull the blanket off or whatever, the sheet off. And people are like, that's the first reaction. Yep. So it's similar in that respect, because you don't know, and you get this thing out there, and it's in the wild. And and now people can tell you. So it back in 1985, a bad review is going to come. Maybe if you were lucky enough for a newspaper to even review your book, but let's just say you were a well-known author with a last name like King or something like that, and it's out there. And where was someone going to tell you that they hate your book? Like, if you go to a party and someone walks up and tells you, at a book signing, maybe. But most of the book signings are are there because they like your work and like the book. But now everyone can tell you how much they hate your work, or you leave review, whatever it is. So anyway, it's so
Yeah.
yeah, you're doing this process to create this thing, and in my case, that thing is a book. And I'm doing everything I possibly can to make it the best book it can possibly be. But then eventually there's a deadline, and out it goes.
Yeah.
I got the first review for Only the Dead, and you're still, you're nervous. And I didn't know it was coming in, and my publicist sent it to me, and it's by the Real Book Spy, and it's an awesome review. It's 10 out of 10 for him, which he doesn't have.
Damn.
And it's an incredible review. I've already printed it just in case AI gets in there and changes it. So I printed it up. I'm gonna start doing that from now on.
I like that.
Talking these things in a file, but the review was so cool to read, and so that is a bit of a relief because you really don't know until it's out there. But to have that come in from him and the things that he said in there was very humbling, very humbling.
That's awesome. Okay, so 3 questions, then I'll get you out of here. First, that I like to ask people, Jack, is as you look back on your time in service, what was the most courageous thing you saw? Not that you did, but that you kind of witnessed or about.
Ooh, I mean, some of that stuff becomes almost normal, exposing yourself to enemy fire, to throw a 40 Mike out of a window during the day when there's mortars, RPGs, and small arms fire coming in. That sort of a thing was always, I guess, what stands out to me. But more so, it's the volunteerism part of it. One early on in Afghanistan jumps to mind right off the bat, where it was a meet or a snatch. I think it was a snatch, but it was going to require one person to go out in indigenous clothes. I think maybe it must have had one other person with them, but from a partner force to go do this thing, and to have just people volunteer. It wasn't even a question. It wasn't like oh, we should think about this. It's kind of dangerous. It was like, send me. And to see that as a constant, but that just example popped to mind. And then I think it's the everyday stuff. It's the guys getting on the kilos, getting in the gun trucks, knowing that they're going into an area that's heavily IED'd. This is their job, and they're just doing it day in, day out. That's their normal. Also, the guys I know that were on the Bin Laden raid, everybody I know in that raid didn't think they were coming home. They thought it was one
Wow.
way.
Yeah.
They got on those helos anyway. That's why I have so much respect for everybody that got on those helos that night, because they thought, and I don't know everybody on that mission, obviously, but I know a few, and all of them didn't think they were coming home. So I think just this knowing that those people are out there that are getting on those helicopters and going in regardless, with the expectation that they're not coming home on that mission in particular, and that there are Americans out there that are training up to do that each and every day. I think that's it. I think it's more of an overall just appreciation really for those guys.
Yeah, I love that. Another question I like to ask people, when you were downrange, was there anything that you carried with you that you wanted to have on you that had sentimental value, something that somebody gave you that you just wanted to have nearby?
No, because I never wrote the death letter, that sort of a thing.
Really?
No, I didn't, because in every movie growing up in the 80s, what happened? As soon as you write that
You're
thing,
dead for
you're
sure.
done.
You're dead.
Done. So
That's funny.
Again, the power of popular culture. So I never did that. If there was any sort of a totem, it was my SIG P226, because that remained a constant, no matter where I was, even if I wasn't supposed to be armed. I would take off my body armor, leave my M4 wherever it was supposed to go, and go into a meeting where I wasn't supposed to be armed with my SIG. Even though that's a fairly large pistol for concealment, that's what I was given. So that's what I would use. So I would always have that with me. So I think that's probably, if there's a totem or something like that I can think back on, because I had it with every deployment, even if what was on my M4 would switch up, or the mount for my Surefire Scout would be a little different because something was developed that kept it a little closer in there, that would just tighten things up a little bit. That constant was my SIG P226. So I might think of something else, but I didn't carry like a coin, or I didn't carry a thing. It was all everything I carried was to be the most effective and efficient as possible, nothing extra. And I can see pictures how I slimmed down over my time, like how many magazines and where and all that stuff things were. So we got pretty, you can tell the difference between some right after September 11th until my last deployment. You can just see things shift on the rifle and on my first line gear, second line gear. And it's cool to see. But yeah, I'd say my SIG P226 is always on my
that.
that'll be my totem. That'll be my good luck charm.
Yeah. And then last question, just looking back many years in the teams, probably had to bury a lot of people. It's just a naturally inherently dangerous part of the military. Would you go back and do that time again?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's part of life, has been time, part of society from the beginning of time up to this day. And it's part of that journey. When you can lock yourself away and not stand up to serve or defend your nation, not go out and provide, let's say as a hunter, provide food and sustenance for your family, for your tribe, for your society. But there needs to be those people that stand on the wall and that train up to be ready for when that fight comes. So it's just I'm naturally wired for that. So there was really never even a question about it. So yeah, it's I definitely go back, and I mean, it's just natural. There's no other path. If you're a warrior and you're hearing that calling, it's you answer the answers. That's all I did was answer the call.
Man, Jack, thanks so much. So Only the Dead, when can people get it?
It comes out on May 16th, audio, ebook, and hardcover. And Ray Porter, incredible guy. He does the narration for all my books. Just a great guy, and so he's reading this one again. And yeah, May 16th out there in all those formats.
All right. Thanks so much, Jack. I really appreciate the time. I know you're on a book tour. You got a lot going on. Thank you for spending time with us.
Oh man, this was fantastic. Hopefully I'll talk to you again one of these days soon.
I hope you enjoyed that podcast. It went by way too fast. Just a couple listener comments. First, I want to thank a few people having joined our Patreon community. Thank you to Richard Villarino and whoever the cheeky polecat is. We've had a couple comments going back and forth in there. Thank you both for signing up. As for some listener comments, we have an Apple 5-star review from Mario RHDZ. It says, great podcast. As someone in the world of defense and foreign policy, this podcast does a great job of inspiring me and my peers. Keep up the great work. Just want to say thank you for leaving that. We don't touch on current foreign affairs all that much, but I think just the context around everything that we do touch on gives enough of a feeling to those who do work in that space. So thank you for leaving that. And then some great comments we had left on YouTube. One from Roger McMillan, and this was on our David Burke interview. He says, I really appreciate the quality of your content on this podcast, Ryan. I watched David with another pilot, Tom Koppel, F4 driver during NAM, talking about carrier quals and night landings. Made me understand that these men had a job that was life or death, guaranteed, no exceptions, every time they would wrap up another sortie. Could not imagine the amount of stress knowing that these aviators face daily. Much respect to all you fly boys and girls. Yeah, we talk about it a lot with these naval aviators, Marines. Landing on a carrier at night sounds like maybe the hardest thing you have to do. I thought some of the stuff we did in the Apache was tough, but it's nothing like that. And then just a couple other comments from some of our subscribers. From WB, this is on the Mike Rutledge podcast, says, I was in Mike's Buds class, and I can tell you he is a character, funny AF, and a great guy. And I got to agree with you. I could just tell, I didn't spend as much one-on-one time with him, obviously, back in flight school, but it was pretty apparent he lit up a room. And Joshua Asgarian, another subscriber on YouTube, says, one of the best episodes I have ever listened to. Thanks for sharing. Man, I really appreciate that. And actually, L. Clark said the same. He said, Ryan, OMG, dude, I don't know where to start. Listen, I've watched all your episodes. There's something about this one. And this is the Mike Rutledge interview. He says, wow, thanks for bringing this to us. When I saw the almost 3-hour time count, I came close to skipping it, but I'm so glad I didn't. This was one of the very best episodes to date. Keep them coming, you rock. Thank you so much for leaving that, man. It means a ton to me to know that somebody like Mike is getting this great reception. And his episode is blowing up over 100,000 views. So thank you for that. Thank you all for taking the time spend with us. And as Jack said on this one, I know you got a lot of other options there for entertainment. I really appreciate you sitting down and listening to the stories of these warriors and these heroes. It means a ton. Stay safe, y'all.